Hello there, people of the internet. I've got a little history lesson for you guys today. So we're looking at the time period from about the 1850s to approximately the 1870s, where Colt percussion cap revolvers were one of the more mainstream style of repeating handgun that you could find here inside the United States. Of course, it was not the only revolver that was out there on the market, but it definitely was one of the more popular ones. So the concept behind the cap and ball revolver is pretty gosh darn simple. In the case of the Colt revolvers, they had an open frame, open top, and the idea was that you basically just pour your powder down inside of a cylinder, and then you put a ball in. You got yourself a built-in ramrod right on the revolver that you can use to ram that ball home, and then you put a percussion cap onto one of the nipples. You do that 6 times and you have yourself 6 shots inside of your percussion cap revolver. Revolutionary for the time period whenever these were developed and came out, because most of your handguns were only single shot. So that was definitely, like I said, revolutionary. Whenever these took off and really started getting popular, it was the late 1840s, early 1850s, around that time period. There were the Colt Walkers that came before the Colt 1851 model, but this is not a history lesson on Colt revolvers. This is me talking about well, I guess the controversy between open cylinder and percussion cap revolvers. So in the 1850s, especially in like the 1860s or so, metallic cartridge firing guns were very much a thing. The only problem with using metallic cartridge firing systems in a revolver is that you needed some sort of open cylinder for said revolver. And, well, during the time period that we're discussing, that was actually patented and held in patent by a guy named Rollin White. Now, Rollin White actually approached Colt and offered him that patent for that open cylinder, upon which Colt denied it, which was definitely not a smart move on Colt's part. Now, that being said, Colt still did make a very, 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 very good and successful business with his percussion cap revolvers, although he could not use metallic firing cartridges until after that patent had expired. That being said, just because Colt was making percussion cap revolvers, which were, I guess, could be considered antiquated technology compared to metallic firing cartridges, Smith and Wesson actually held they held that patent for those open cylinder revolvers. There were not a whole lot of Smith and Wesson revolvers that were all that mainstream besides like pocket revolvers. For the most part, your Smith and Wesson revolvers back in the day tended to be lower power and lower caliber than that of the Colt revolvers. This right here is not a Smith & Wesson revolver. This is an Iver Johnson that was actually made back in the 1890s. But it is a good example of what you would expect from a Smith & Wesson revolver back in the day. This particular one is chambered in 32 Smith & Wesson. I'm not 100% positive on when that metallic firing cartridge actually came out, but the concept behind having a little tiny revolver round inside of your revolver for the Smith & Wesson models is basically, like I said, represented here. So the Smith & Wesson models back in the day, there were a bunch of ways to load it, but one of the more common ways was to have an open top revolver, just like this, or an open hinge revolver, just like this, to where you could open your revolver, then loading your rounds. There's an ejector built onto this thing so you can get out your spent casings. This right here definitely was revolutionary for back during that time period. Of course, Smith & Wesson, they did end up coming out with their Schofield model. So the Schofield model is one example of a full-powered handgun cartridge for that particular time period, but a dramatic amount of the Smith & Wesson revolvers that utilized the open cylinder and metallic cartridges were of a smaller, less powerful design. Now, in 1872, I do believe it is, that patent for that open cylinder actually ended up expiring, and so Colt ended up coming out with their transitional 1871, 1872 open-top revolver, whatever it is that you want to call it. They were actually chambered in 44 Henry rimfire back in the day. This is a new-made one, chambered in 38 special, simply because that is a dramatically easier round to get than the 44 Henry rimfire that these originally would have been in. But this right here is an example of an 1872 style of revolver. And of course, Colt would end up making a full frame revolver that became the 1873 Colt single action army. Now, versus the top brake system that Smith & Wesson was using, Colt ended up going with an ejection gate that we have on the side of the revolver here, and you use an ejection rod to push rounds out through that gate. Let me cock my cylinder right here. To push rounds out through that gate, just like that, and you load your rounds in one at a time. It's a pretty gosh darn simple system, but it's a lot slower to load one of these style of systems than one of Smith & Wesson's open top revolvers, just like that, or top brake revolvers. I keep saying open top. I do apologize about that one. The only problem with these old Smith & Wessons, like I said, was they did not have a whole lot of power behind them. For the most part, in the 1850s and 1860s and going up into the 1870s, most of your Smith & Wesson revolvers like this were more or less pocket guns, and I mean, they served that job really well. Those pocket guns were extremely popular, extremely common, but that being said, they weren't exactly your fighting handgun back in the day. Colt definitely got that reputation because they had larger caliber, more powerful handguns for that time period. Now, had Colt actually gone with buying that patent from Rollin White, we might have seen a different change in history. We might have seen firearms technology and revolvers take a completely different turn. Maybe cap and ball revolvers would not have been nearly as popular as they were. They really were only popular because of legal restriction. That being said, great handguns. They definitely could still do the job today if you wanted to use one of these to do a job. But if Colt had access to those open cylinders and metallic firing cartridges, then maybe we would not see it nearly as much percussion cap history as we do, and maybe Colt would have come up with something more similar to this right here, or maybe their 1872 would have come out in like 1860. Maybe the 1860 Colt wouldn't have even existed, and the 1860 Colt would have turned into a metallic firing cartridge. Who knows? Who knows what kind of history would have popped up during that time period, but I do know that Colt turning down that patent was definitely not a good move by them, and I do know that Smith & Wesson did not utilize that patent to the best of their capabilities, and we just see that from the results and evolution of revolvers of today's time period. Now, Colt, once they ended up getting access to that patent because it had expired in 1872, their metallic firing revolvers definitely took off by storm, and the 1873 Colt single action army was by a huge margin one of the most popular handguns in American history and during that time period. So I think that's pretty much all I have to say about this. It's just a cool concept. I had these guns here and it popped into my mind, so I figured I'd go ahead and I'd make a little video about this. There's a lot of details that I left out here, but I think that this is a good general little overview. Thanks for watching, folks. I appreciate your time. Like, subscribe, share. Description below has a link to all sorts of stuff. Go check it out. You guys go off, have yourself a fantastic day, and I will see you guys on the next episode. Since I've done this. Bonnie and Clyde be damned. The poor man's Garen.
Shame that bolt action shotguns aren't more mainstream.